Welcome, everyone. How you doing today? I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times, and thanks for joining us today as we take a pragmatic view of DevOps in large enterprises. Before we get started, I have a couple of brief housekeeping announcements. First, today's program is being recorded and will be available on demand in the SD Times Learning Center and via email in the next day or so. Second, we're going to welcome your questions throughout this interactive discussion as opposed to just waiting till the end. If you want us to elaborate on a point or answer a question you might have, simply go into your control panel, find the questions tab, submit the question, and we'll get to as many as time allows. All right, so here we go. As we've been writing in SD Times, DevOps is seen as the key to a digital transformation, which will enable companies to increase their software delivery speeds, gain efficiencies in their operations, and maximize the value of their efforts. Yet studies show that some 40% of organizations still are doing waterfall development. So clearly, it's not enough to go faster just for speed's sake. We'll be taking a sober, pragmatic look at DevOps where the reality doesn't quite align with the hype and what organizations can do to be successful with DevOps. Joining me today will be Julian Fish and Mark Levy from the DevOps tools company Micro Focus. Julian is Director of Product Management for Application Release Orchestration, and Mark is Director of Product Marketing for Application Delivery Management. So let's take a look at the current state of DevOps when we get started, where we are, why organizations are still struggling 10 years after the concept of DevOps came to be. Okay, Mark, want to get us started?
Great, David. Thank you for leading us and opening up, and thanks everybody for spending a little time with us today. It's interesting. It's a very, I thought this was a very appropriate and interesting topic, and it's interesting too. Right before the webinar, the DevOps Institute just released their latest survey on upskilling DevOps skills, and it had some very interesting statistics too. And the fact is, like you mentioned, we're 10 years in this DevOps sort of journey, and really a lot of people are still struggling implementing DevOps. In fact, according to the latest survey from the DevOps Institute, over 50% of the enterprises that they surveyed are still having trouble implementing DevOps. About 44% of the enterprises surveyed there are doing DevOps more at sort of the team level and the project level, and about 23% are trying to scale DevOps across the enterprise. And I think that really reflects the fact that DevOps is hard, and it also sort of aligns with what Gartner has been talking about for a while, that 80% of the DevOps initiatives are not going to sufficiently meet the business requirements for the next couple of years. You sort of have to back up for a second and say why DevOps, and really, and in the enterprise, and what are the issues facing large enterprises when they implement DevOps practices. I think first and foremost, it's just the whole nature of business and software are becoming one and the same, right? Software innovation and business innovation are becoming one and the same. And when you have software failures and problems today, you have business failures. And so it's been demonstrated by the DevOps unicorns that DevOps practices improve quality and improve time to market. But large enterprises have a lot of different types of issues. If you look at a large enterprise, the reality is that these large enterprises are really complex, hybrid landscapes. And so this is the, sort of the problem that you have to solve is, how do you take, and you talked about sort of how do you become efficient across, this environment and satisfy the business. Now, a lot of people, sort of look at it like, some teams work on legacy apps and others are creating microservices in large enterprises. And so it's sort of unrealistic to expect sort of the same release schedule. And I think what you have to really do, instead of thinking of it as a push, like, how fast can we deliver? You have to look at it like, well, what are the needs of the business? How fast does the business need it? So you have to sort of flip, your concept from a push to a pull. And so what needs to be pulled? What needs to be worked on? What's important? Where do you start? Because this can be, just an all-encompassing project, and to take sort of the DevOps, some of the main DevOps principles of small batch loads. Well, to implement DevOps in an enterprise, you sort of have to look at that as well. Is to start focusing on the right stuff. Julian, I know you joined us. Do you have any sort of commentary in this area?
No, I think you're absolutely right there, Mark. I think one of the challenges that organizations fail to think about is that DevOps is not a team game. It's an entire organizational transformation project, and the reality is that whilst team-centric DevOps transformation may be successful and may drive value, significant value and ROI for particular teams or particular parts of the business, we need to try to make that repeatable. There's some great insight that's been published recently. The number of organizations who claim they're doing DevOps versus the number of organizations who claim they're doing DevOps at an enterprise level, and that enterprise level is so much lower. Now, doing enterprise DevOps doesn't necessarily mean that every team has to behave or every team has to work in the same way. We always see variations of delivery model. We always see, let's say, a multimodal approach, multi-speed approach for different applications, different application development teams. The challenge and the trick is being able to tie together those different speeds, those different modes of delivery, those different teams who are doing DevOps and the teams who aren't doing DevOps, the ability to be able to provide a consistent point of visibility and control across all of those teams, and then to scale that out into the complexity of the enterprise world. Again, it's kind of easy for some organizations, maybe a relatively new organization or young organization that started off and has built everything from the ground up using maybe a microservices-based architecture with containerization to the fore, using technologies like Spinnaker or Armory to deliver those capabilities. But for an enterprise organization where you have the legacy or the legendary applications that need to be delivered in the same rate of velocity as maybe some of the more modern applications, certainly some of the mobile applications, it becomes way, way more challenging. And of course, for most large enterprises, it isn't a single technology stack that we're talking about. It's not a Kubernetes-based container delivery model. It's a number of common off-the-shelf systems. It may be an ERP tool like an SAP. It may be an Oracle ERP tool. It may be multiple or a myriad different database technologies, different application languages, different coding styles and practices that have built up over time. Ultimately, we need to find this way to be able to drive all of those different levels of complexity, different delivery models, different cycle times into an end result that delivers huge value to our customers. And from an IT practitioner perspective, my customer is the business. So delivering value to the end business, which in turn delivers value to the customers of our business. And being able to do that it's not a simple case of, hey, let's throw some terms around, let's do some CI/CD, let's do some continuous inspection, let's automate some code deliveries, and let's throw things into production. It's a very, very intertwined and very, very complex approach that needs to be taken into consideration. And the fact that we have all of these different delivery vehicles that we're also working against, development teams working in cloud systems, development teams working in container systems, virtualized systems, physical systems. Some teams were still working on the mainframe side. Some teams are looking to offboard mainframes. Some teams are using mid-range. And how do we work with all of that complexity and tie it all together in a way that, like I said, makes sense for us as IT professionals to be able to simplify that flow, but makes sense for the individuals who are working on those project teams, and it doesn't impact their day-to-day deliveries and their day-to-day working practices too much. So yeah, it's an incredibly complex world that we're trying to address.
Yeah, I really like this sort of slide. I took it from Gartner, but it shows, I believe, sort of a cross-section cut of like a typical enterprise in some ways, right? Where you have sort of different systems and different methodologies, and this is dynamic. It's not static, right? You might have waterfall teams going through an agile transformation, right? The platforms are changing, going from on-prem to cloud, and so you have, and I've heard an analogy. It's like, flying a 747 and redesigning it at the same time. That's what large enterprises are sort of faced with. They have to go through this transformation, but they still have to, run their day-to-day operations. So this, I find, is one of the key challenges.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Julian, about the multimodal, because we know in organizations, as you said, some are working on legacy applications, others creating microservices, working in the cloud. So it would be unrealistic to expect them to be on the same release schedule. So what does the going again, as you said, from the team level and scaling up organization-wide, how do organizations envision the future of DevOps, and what does the future state of DevOps look like?
Mark, you want to pick that one up first, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I'll do is I'd like to, I would like to sort of start really broad, and then Julian could sort of dive down into specifics, okay? And so this idea of, what are the challenges getting to that state, of the future state, and ultimately what the future state is, really satisfying the needs of the business in being able to deliver value when the business needs it, as opposed to when IT could deliver it. And so I'm going to just back up and go to sort of, the 20,000 foot level first, and then I'll let Julian sort of peel the onion and dive into it. And so, you got to start with, I love this Deming quote, a bad system will beat a good person every time, and so the idea is, you have to change the system, okay? And, there's a lot of very good intentioned people and brilliant and bright teams, but, if you have, and when I say system, I think of the holistic, the whole system, you got to start there. And that's one of the big challenges. That's why they think, the culture is so prevalent in DevOps, and in that, you really got to define the behaviors that you want, that you want to be responsive to the business as opposed to your own, siloed, goals, and you got to start there. And so, so that's how I would look first. Is, as an example, like if Dev typically is incented to drive a lot of change, and Ops is incented to mitigate change, those are like at opposites, and so you have to solve a lot of that first, before you can move forward. And a lot of people, sort of look at this and say, well, there's sort of this JCurve effect when you start doing this transformation, where you're going to have sort of a quick win, and then you start solving these big hard problems that we're going to talk about, these technical challenges and things like that. But really, what it really turns out to be is there's many JCurves. There's always going to be these curves, whether it's solving the hard problems or business objective changes, or organizational is change. Culture is mutable, culture is constantly changing, and then there's technology change. And so that's why you really have to, implement this culture of really continuous improvement, because what it ends up looking like is this, where, you really got to get the team and the organization, into this mode of constant change, and standardizing on the new change, and then going forward, and then understanding what that future state is. So I think that at the high level, you need to have that in progress. And then there's a bunch of course, technical challenges, which I think Julian can sort of dive into in how to manage and look towards the future state.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think with all of this, I mean, culture plays such a huge part of any kind of enterprise DevOps transformation. To Mark's earlier point, you've got dev, which may be incentivized one way, ops another way. You've got the quality guys who always seem to be squeezed in the middle. And obviously, we're trying to align all parts of the software development lifecycle. We're trying to simplify the approach that everyone has. We're trying to standardize the flow of the development process, so we don't have the lumpiness that we've had in the past. In a previous existence, when I was working with customers, there was always the challenge where dev and test would throw something over the wall to the release or the operations teams and say, hey, yeah, go put it in production. And we've thankfully moved away from that mindset. Well, at least most organizations have, and DevOps has certainly driven a lot of that change. A lot of the time, we still see that lumpiness between a dev and a quality organization, for example, organizations where they haven't really gone into true maybe agile transformation mode. They don't have quality embedded as part of the dev team. We still see that lumpy handover from the dev guys. Hey, my build is cool. Throw it into the application testing environment, and the testers are saying, no, number one, you're going too fast for us because we're getting every single commit that you're building, and every single commit that goes into the repo is getting built, and we're expected to test it. And secondly, what am I testing? Can I get the visibility into what's happening? So we've got all the challenges around culture that we need to fix. I think a lot of organizations are using DevOps as a way to look at the future of their application structure. So to the earlier point that David made, or everything that we talk about, the future state of DevOps, I think the ultimate goal of almost every organization is to get to that sort of purist approach where the application infrastructure, the application architecture, the application delivery models are simply code commit, spin up an environment, get the application into the environment, get it running. If it fails or if there's a problem along the deployment path or the way that we're pipelining to production, go back to dev, spin through that cycle very quickly, and ultimately get it into production. And if it fails in production because of the architectures that we've built out, spin another instance up and use almost like a DCOS or a data center OS type approach to create new infrastructure. But that's a long way away for a lot of organizations. So I think the future state is really a hybrid approach of applications that can be re-architected, applications that have been re-architected or have been designed from the ground up and already have that simplified application delivery process, and then the legendary or the slightly older applications that are really the mainstay of the business, tying back to that multimodal approach, the systems of innovation, the systems of record, the systems of differentiation, and being able to say, okay, from a business perspective, which one of these applications makes the most sense to modernize first? And that might be the most complicated one. Yeah, sorry, Mark.
Yeah, Julian, I mean, a lot of people I find, do you find make decisions are made with only sort of this new state in mind, meaning they buy tools for the new stuff, and they forget that there's this transformation
exactly
that has to happen, that you have to run your business and innovate the new, and so I think decisions get missed.
Yeah, definitely.
You know what I mean? They're always looking. Yeah, we got to be agile. We got to get the newest stuff. Well, what about how do you move the old to the new?
Exactly. To your earlier analogy, if we think about it, it's not just flying the plane and changing the wings as we're flying. It's flying the plane, changing the wings, and also changing the end destination, because we're changing how the business is operating and the IT function delivering that business value. So we're no longer going to New York. We're suddenly now going to San Francisco, and we're changing the wings and we're flying and we're trying to beat the competition. It's an incredibly complicated process, but ultimately, ultimately the end goal is that modernization of application architectures and structures. It's the simplification and the best value to get there, which ones are the applications that make the most sense for us to work with first. And then it's the adoption of these cultural practices that help us out. And one of the areas that, again, we tend to focus on, we talk a lot about with our customers, is comms. It's a very, very sort of extensively used phrase in the DevOps ecosystem, the collaboration, automation, lean measurement, sharing, and from my perspective, I always add an extra S to the end, which is security. But making sure that the cultural shift includes that comms notion, always thinking about where can we automate inefficiencies out? Where can we drive lean process improvement? Where can we track and trace how we're delivering? And that ties into everything that an organization starts thinking about future state of DevOps, the application modernization, the prioritization of modernization, and the linking together of all of these different systems. Because to Mark's point, we have to keep the business running at the same time as modernization. Wow, that was a long answer for you there, David.
Yeah. So no, I just wanted to jump in. I hear this all the time talking to people where they talk about you have to change the culture. You have to change the culture. And of course, we're all technical people, so they can tell you in great detail how to set up a CI/CD pipeline and a lot of the other technical aspects. And then at the end, it's almost like, oh, and you also have to change your culture, as if it's a snap of the fingers and everybody is now on board.
Yeah.
So actually, that leads to a question that we have from one of our attendees. And I guess the question is, do you need to be all in with this mindset of DevOps, or the question is, can you still do DevOps even with teams that are using waterfall development methods?
Oh, that's a great question. I can take a first stab if you'd like, Mark, and we can take it
Go
from
ahead.
there. Yeah, I think there are certain aspects of DevOps transformation that really can make a huge amount of a huge amount of benefit, let's try that way, and also make a huge difference to the organizational optimization processes that we're trying to implement. Just because we're running a traditional review model or a spiral or a waterfall development cycle doesn't mean we can't implement CI/CD practices. So for example, it doesn't mean that if I'm running against a functional design and I've got my unit test mapped to that, and I've got a design specification, I've got my user acceptance test mapped to that in old V model form, it doesn't mean that development piece that happens at the bottom can't still iterate very quickly. We went through the pseudo iterative phase. I mean, there's terminology out there. We see the notion of sort of a scrum fall type delivery cycle, and that incremental or iterative delivery model tied into things like continuous integration, with continuous integration using maybe continuous code inspection, continuous security scanning, and then into continuous delivery is a really great way to start first changing the mindset of the organization. So whilst we're still maintaining our traditional delivery models, we're getting people to start thinking about things like CI, maybe even putting a continuous delivery pipeline in place that deploys to an integration test environment. Maybe that's as far as we need to go to start off with. And certainly maybe with some of our waterfall model where we're doing slightly bigger increments, it makes sense to go into that integration model. And then the second part. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Julian. I'm sorry, dive in here. This is a really interesting topic. I was taking it, you have to sort of look at it like, can you or should you make your waterfall more efficient? Because maybe some of your waterfall teams, they're really not going to transition to Agile for some time, if at all. And so what if you could make optimize your waterfall process by 30%? What if your developers in waterfall if you were able to look and map where their constraints are, that they spent 5 or 10% of their time waiting on approvals, and if you were able to automate those approvals, you can recapture, let's say, 10% or 5% of your developers' time. If you have 100 or 200 developers doing that, that's a tremendous amount of value recapture that you can then redeploy someplace else. So there's a lot of value in that.
Absolutely. And then again, what we're always trying to think about as we go down this route of transformation and implementing DevOps practices, we really want to get to the point where we can identify the value of change. And that might be, it might start off with some kind of pseudo mapping between what we predict the value of the change to be to the ultimate 3 months later when we've been tracking that change in production for a while, a captured or perceived value of the change. But again, tying those practices in, even if we're doing waterfall, we can then do far better definition and far better alignment of which changes we're actually going to implement. The ones that we see as the higher value change, tied into the process improvements that Mark was talking about, lean process optimization from a waterfall or a traditional development perspective, starts building up this big picture where we're seeing significant cost savings across the entire development lifecycle through into the testing lifecycle and the deployment lifecycle, picking up on the high value changes, again, focusing on those, simplifying the development processes or taking the waste out of the development processes. Adds huge value to organizations who aren't or don't want to transition to agile practices. And again, there's some very valid reasons why you may not want to be agile. And specifically when you're looking at maybe some implementations around embedded software with clean room practices where it's very expensive to go through a cycle. You don't want to be churning constantly. You want to be working in a way that you know what's getting burnt into those devices or is being manufactured in that clean room is 100% accurate or as close to 100% accurate as possible.
That's an excellent answer to that, which also leads to another question that we have from our panelists. And the point that I would make is, so we seem to be getting away from these dogmatic, all or nothing approaches to Agile and DevOps, and the industry has kind of come to accept whatever you can do. I think, Mark, you made the point, to be more efficient. It really doesn't matter whether you're, following the letter of DevOps and Agile and things like that. So you were just talking about how you can kind of weave waterfall and things into DevOps processes. So we have a question from one of our attendees who says their organization follows ITSM and GRC is very important to them, and they're wondering how DevOps can be weaved into those approaches, or those approaches can be weaved into DevOps.
That's a great question, Mark. Do you want to take that one? And I'll jump in afterwards.
Well, I know, and I know ITEL version 4 just recently came out, and I know they've worked the Axlos guys, the guys that are actually now own the spec, have been working really hard to because at first I know there was some friction, but I believe service management is still widely used and very important. And I think, and they've always, in some ways, been involved in understanding lean. And so I think version 4 is sort of that start of implementing, DevOps practices. So the idea is that they can, they can definitely coexist. And I believe that, especially around, I think the one area around ITEL that was giving people heartburn, I think, is around the change management process. And I'll hand over to my colleague Julian to sort of drill into it. But sort of a lightweight change management process still is very required in the enterprise.
Yeah, definitely. I think if we look at where we were with ITIL v3 and service transition and service delivery, we started going down this route of being more willing to accept incremental change to operations. Again, we're trying to get away from the mindset that we have to use the ITIL v1, ITIL v2, very prescriptive, very defined ITSM processes. ITIL v3 and certainly ITIL v4 transitions that to a much more dynamic model. And ITIL v4 covers a number of different areas. We're still talking about service design, we're still talking about service delivery, but we're doing it in ways where we include practices, for example, like release management as part of that enterprise delivery model. And ultimately the challenge that we need to address, and one of the big challenges that we've always faced, is the visibility into change. The ITSM folks, the folks on the operations side, the folks who are using a packaged or a model delivery paradigm, we have change windows, we have delivery cycles. they don't like to be surprised at the last minute. Hey, let's face it, when we're talking about all of these elements, when we're talking about change, none of us likes change. It's a very, very strange inbuilt human nature fact. And also, people don't like to be surprised. I might scream out loud, or if I'm in operations, I might scream at my development, my quality, my release folks, if I'm not aware that there are new changes coming towards me. And one of the nice things that we can do with DevOps practices is we can start aligning those ITSM service delivery practices and say, hey, yes, we have a change from the dev side that is going to make it into production, give that early phase visibility. And again, let's face it, from an enterprise perspective, very few organizations are really willing or ready to adopt this notion of no ops. We're making our code change, it's going through our pipeline, it's going to production, nobody's involved. Most organizations are still risk averse and still change averse. So that earlier indication of the change coming, the earlier indication of the content of the change, so ITSM practices around service models can be utilized to potentially understand the impact of that change if the dev team hasn't been able to get to that level of maturity yet, is a massive, massive benefit for ITSM and the service management organization. So there's some big benefits with aligning these DevOps practices, not necessarily just saying, hey, we've got a pipeline, stuff's coming down the pipeline, but saying, yes, we've got code going through a pipeline, it's associated with change. Those change tickets are associated with an operational change. Again, it could be a service management ITSM change request that's going into an application server, for example. It could have dependent service changes that are taking place from an infrastructure perspective. Tying that level of visibility together really gives us some big significant wins for both sides. The ops guys, because they're getting the visibility, and yeah, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, no, you mentioned the visibility is so important, and people got to realize too that, you know, the understanding change, you know, what outside of the IT organization is very important too. There's a lot of other teams, like when you implement software now, you know, marketing organizations, sales organizations, all these stakeholders outside of IT need to understand when, you know, that change hits production, because they might have their own programs that they have to drive. And so it all has to be coordinated. So understanding that and providing that visibility of change, it's not just about delivering artifacts in the deployment pipeline, right? It's because those artifacts are going to drive a number of, you know, behaviors, right, throughout the company.
Exactly.
And so you got to have that visibility. That's key.
And I guess the final thing that really ties into that ITSM practice and being able to implement DevOps practices that align into the service delivery models is the whole notion of closed loop. We're not making changes in isolation. Everything we're doing is from a closed loop perspective. The change was instantiated somewhere. We got that change for a reason. And it went through our end-to-end product delivery lifecycle. It ends up in our production system. We're running our application performance monitoring. That may raise an incident, or we may have help desk users getting calls or instant messages saying, hey, we've got a problem with the application. We need to be able to get the level of visibility. The release has gone through the pipeline from the dev perspective. We want to tie all of those incidents, which may generate problems and changes, into the release, into the entity that's come out from the development side, so we can feed it back into the start of the funnel. If that incident becomes a problem and becomes a change, we need to feed that back into the start of the pipeline and track through our delivery of our subsequent release, if that's a patch, if that's a data fix. So we've got that closed loop cycle. And once we've got the closed loop cycle, we can really then start looking at the end-to-end value stream that we're managing and we're trying to optimize as part of this long-term DevOps transformation.
Yep, that's a really good point. Now, we know that a lot of applications, when you're talking about you know, the releases, a lot of them have different requirements, and they're not all going to be going on the same pace. So I understand now that organizations are starting to use release management processes and tools like that to smooth things out. So how far does that get organizations, including IT, to successfully implement DevOps, and how important is release management in that phase?
Mark, I think you know what my answer is going to be, so you can take this one first.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, release management is, of course, very important. And I think, you know, really the sort of transition is, and the pivot is, I think, is towards the concept of release orchestration, which includes, a form of release management. And it's really this whole idea of this combination of deployment automation and pipeline and environment management and release orchestration capabilities within the release management process. I think this is sort of where people are starting to pivot, because with this, you can provide, and I'll have Julian sort of drill into this, you can provide and manage that multimodal type of support, whether you're running, you might have a deployment pipeline and a bunch of teams running CI/CD, where they just want artifacts and you need to associate a change to these artifacts. You may need to combine them. And then you may also have the traditional release train methods. So Julian, you want to sort of open this up? And
you've hit the nail on the head there, Mark. Definitely. I think traditional release management approaches have certainly modernized, much in the same way that development practices have modernized over the last 5, 10, 15 years. We now look at something like application release orchestration as a mechanism to tie together the value of everything we're delivering. It's going back to the earlier point that you made, David. These organizations have loads of different technology types. They have the hybrid world of on-prem cloud and public cloud. They have containerization, they have virtualization, they have physical infrastructure provisioning, they have rapidly changing application technologies and application models. And the key from the application release orchestration perspective is to layer across all of those technologies. So we still have the governance, the audits, and the compliance controls that we need for effective release management, but we also have the ability to integrate into multiple tools and technologies in the same way, which allows us to normalize data. So we're comparing apples with apples when we're looking across different development teams, across different testing teams, or different product lines, and then being able to track important things like dependencies between applications. That's an area that a lot of our customers struggle with. A lot of organizations we talk to say, I get it. We've got teams who can go really fast. We've got teams who are going a little bit more slowly. We've got a release defined process, which says we do a release every month, which is a major release. We don't do a release in December because it's change freeze time. These other 11 releases, how do we make sure that everything's onboarded in the right manner? How do we make sure that if we update one of the systems, the other system is updated in the same way? How do we make sure that if we have a dependency between a release or a component of an application that's reused, we can track all of those dependencies, and we can make sure that the right versions of the applications and the application releases are going out together? And that's really where we get to with this modern approach to release management, this orchestrated release concept, which integrates seamlessly into the ITSM solution stack to update those systems. For example, updating a change, or maybe even being triggered by the IT operations system when the operations lead says, yes, we're ready to go into release mode. We click the button, the system is ready and it's willing to accept that we have a downtime period, for example. If we're doing dynamic provisioning, it's great because we have no downtime. We can do blue-green transformation and multiple deployments. But if we have that change window, and the guy in his IT management, ITSM system clicks the button, we want to orchestrate that entire release process with all of those applications, with all of those dependencies. And if one of them fails, allow us to make a conscious decision. Do we want to fix forward? Do we want to roll back? Can we deploy the one application without the other? Do we have to deploy all of these applications together? So yeah, again, trying to address some of the complexities that exist from the release space through using this orchestrated and integrated approach.
And it's not just about orchestrating artifacts too. It's about orchestrating teams, right? I know we had one large healthcare provider that had 90 app dev teams that they are trying to, orchestrate and deliver software. So you need to be able to orchestrate the different processes, right? The different teams or people, as well as the artifacts.
Exactly, and again, you ultimately end up at the point where your infrastructure, as well as your teams, as well as your applications, is all going through the same process, looking for that future state of DevOps that David mentioned earlier on. How do we help the organizations get the transformation done? And how do we get to the point where they're delivering the right level of value through the pipeline, and maybe dynamically creating the infrastructure that goes with the applications, or at least being able to know that the application infrastructure has been provisioned in the same way, using things like change configuration automation or dynamic infrastructure provisioning.
So you guys are, it's great you're talking about how you can bring more things into DevOps and scale it throughout the organization. We have a question from one of our attendees who's talking about their company is struggling to include their mainframe environments in their DevOps practices. And we're wondering if you have any advice on how to do that.
Well, it's a different platform. I mean, it's just a platform in some respects, but again, there's a cultural aspect of it as well. But clearly, especially through like release orchestration, because typically there's dependencies, and Julian, mentioned that dependencies are a fact of life, in enterprises, and so there's a whole bunch of DevOps practices we talked about today about waterfall teams and DevOps and implementing DevOps practices in waterfall teams. So they can leverage a lot of that, and there's a lot of mainframe teams. A lot of our customers have mainframes, and they're plugged into DevOps.
Yeah, and a lot of mainframe organizations are looking to implement some of these DevOps practices. The number of conversations that I have with customers who are putting CI/CD practices in place on the mainframe, who are wanting, just like Mark said, to ensure that these dependencies between our mainframe, which a lot of the time is a high transactional, high value application processing and delivery, ties into our mid-range or our distributed platforms, and ties into our mobile. So we've got all of these changes going together, and again, visibility across those levels of change. So our mainframe, for example, if it's for whatever reason delivering a little bit behind schedule, may have a significant impact upon our mobile application, because ultimately we're representing data in the mobile application that is being served from the mainframe. So how do we make sure that all of that change goes together? If we add a new field that's meant to access some data on the mainframe into our mobile application, and that mainframe release or that mainframe update doesn't get made, our mobile application either won't work, or it'll show blank data or erroneous data, which is even worse. As a consumer of financial products, if I go to my online bank, I want to be 100% sure that the balance that I'm seeing is accurate in real time. I don't want there to be a lag or a problem because of missing connectivity. And it's the same for all of our customers who run mainframe systems. They should be included as part of the end-to-end DevOps transformation process. They can look at modernization practices, but ultimately they have to be included in this whole orchestrated release delivery, and it has to take part and be fully inclusive in that delivery cycle.
That's, again, an interesting point, and leads me to really the last topic I want to touch on today, and that is value stream, where I know people are using this to find waste in their processes, eliminate bottlenecks, gain efficiencies, things of that nature. And when you're talking about bringing in, some mainframe pieces, distributed pieces, cloud, microservices, all these other aspects, getting the full end-to-end visualization is difficult. So how does value stream management, mapping, how does all that help the continuous improvement process?
Yeah, Mark, I know this is a subject close to your heart, so do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I'll start at least. I think the interesting thing is and the DevOps community talks about this idea of system thinking, but we're so used to our own specialty, whether you're QA or whether you're a developer or whether you're a release manager, you really sort of focus on your own sort of silo. And I guess the idea, how many organizations today actually have people that are tasked with understanding, the entire value stream of, because I mean, it's already been proven in manufacturing that the more focus you have from the time of sort of the business request to the time of the actual product, the more efficient, the better the product, and the more efficient you are. But typically with IT, we haven't really had people, or we haven't had that broad view across the silos. We've been so embedded in the silos. So I think that's the key thing. People need to sort of break out and actually get everybody on the same page, and I think that's where you really need to get senior management, committed and involved, to have people focusing on, the value stream across the silos, and to provide, a common view of what delivering value to customer is. What do you think, Julian?
No, definitely.
Single version of the truth.
Exactly. It's kind of interesting because in the IT space, we always seem to be playing catch up. In the 20 something years that I've been in the domain, ultimately, what have we gone through? We've gone through changes where quality was king. Because we realized that organizations, for example, in the automotive space, had really doubled down on quality. If you look at the changes in that space for the last 50 years, quality really drove massive improvements. And from the IT space, again, we're taking practices that are common out in the manufacturing space. For example, in the automotive space, once again, if you look at things like value streams, these notions aren't new. Value streams applied to manufacturing have been around for all manner of years. I mean, we can go to the Toyota production system. We can look at every different aspect of lean process improvement. We can pick up the values that the manufacturing organization have taken, and we can apply them to software delivery. Because ultimately we're trying to deliver through some kind of software engineering factory with commonality of approach, where you have a consistent, if I put something in at the beginning, it's going to go through these steps, it's going to take this long, and this is what's going to come out at the end. And what value stream allows us to do is actually visualize that entire flow. It allows us to map all of our different states throughout our end-to-end delivery cycle. And again, I talk around product-centric delivery rather than application-centric delivery, purely because we're taking a very product-centric view of the world. Organizations are shifting to no longer say, hey, I've got a project that works on an application for a period of time. We have organizations that have products that have many iterative deliveries and releases, maybe even multiple applications as part of that product line, that are managed by teams that are very fluid and dynamic. So the project management discipline changes. Why is that important for value stream? Well, again, ultimately what we're trying to do is track that flow of information. How long does it take our change to go from the idea that comes in through the end-to-end flow, every environment along the way, maybe a requirement solicitation, maybe epic definition, feature definition, through to the developer, the story implementation, the code change, the build process, the continuous integration and continuous inspection cycles, the delivery to a testing environment, the testing, be that manual or automated, the information that is then used, if that testing is successful, to deploy our application to another environment, to be able to run another set of tests, to get quality assurance built into our process, into our staging environments where we're priming for production deploy with all of these dependencies, because multiple product lines may be dependent upon each other, or multiple applications in a product may be dependent upon each other, pushing those into production and tracking the output. And once we can start thinking in that end-to-end manner rather than in siloed ways, which DevOps has helped us break away from, but once we start thinking of the whole, we can then start implementing some of the areas that Mark talked about earlier, lean process improvement. We can look at value stream maps to identify waste through our process and process areas for continuous process improvement. We can look at value stream management and how we manage the ongoing delivery. And we can even look at value stream optimization, how we truly improve that time in state, time through state, not just the MTTR metrics that DevOps folks like to talk about, but actually improving the time in state. So we reduce that time, so the amount of time that people are working on specific areas, or the amount of waste that's happening between one part of the organization and the next is really reduced. And ultimately, like I said, trying to track value from a change perspective through that flow. So yeah, VSM and value stream is a really big building topic for a lot of our customers. There's a huge amount of effort by a load of different vendors in the domain and around the domain. People looking at it from an integration perspective, from a visualization perspective, from a management perspective, and from a governance perspective. So yeah, I guess the answer to that one is it's definitely coming. It's coming faster than I think a lot of folks were expecting, and it's going to drive significant benefits, because again, if you look at some of the benefits that manufacturing saw from implementing value stream practices, it's been absolutely substantial and fairly significant.
Yeah, Julian, interesting though. I'm sorry, I just wanted to jump in here. You look at manufacturing, you look at value stream, and the product that they produce basically never changes. So let's say it's a side view mirror for an automobile. You're going to make the same product the same way every time. So once you get the system down, you eliminate the waste, you're good to go. Software, of course, requirements change on every project. The scope of the project changes every time. So it's really a lot more challenging, in fact, in software development. And to me, value stream adds more value in the software side of things, just because of the fact that things are changing all the time. And this way you have that view where you can see, at least get some kind of predictability into how things are going to go.
And I think a good point, Dave. And I was going to chime in, which sort of supports your idea here. Is we like the first 10 years of DevOps, in some ways we've sort of just really focused first to optimize product delivery, and so we've spent a lot of time building practices and capabilities with product delivery. With value stream management, we've moved upstream, right? We've started now to look at optimizing the areas around product design and portfolio management and requirements and things like that. And so I think, again, it's helping. We're moving into other parts of the value stream to optimize, which I think is awesome.
Yeah, I think to David's point, just to kind of wrap up that whole piece, I think the key is consistency of process, and by using practices that align with VS, we can actually ensure that process is consistent. We're not telling everyone that every single development team has to work in exactly the same way. Again, we've talked around the challenges of multimodal application delivery process, but we have to have a consistency across everything. And once that process is in place, even if the requirements are constantly changing, we can have some idea of how long it would take for a change to flow through that end to end. And that gives us a massive, massive advantage, because we're not recreating the wheel every time we start a new delivery cycle.
Very good. Okay, so before we get into final thoughts from you guys, we do have one more question from our attendees. And this question is about managing the challenges of monolithic architectures when you're trying to implement the DevOps. And I'll throw it out to you guys.
I mean, there's some standard ways that they've prescribed to manage. I'm trying to remember the strangler. Julian, do you remember the strangler concept? With monolithic is to gradually sort of strangle your monolithic app with microservices for all like the new stuff. But I think other people have also made some observations too about monolithic apps. Is maybe you don't need to change it at all if it's working.
I think you're right, Mark. I think that's the key. I mean, there's no point in implementing change for change's sake. If you have a monolithic application that isn't change extensive, doesn't have a huge amount of work done against it, it runs the systems at the back end, maybe you're making a quarterly or a biannual change to the application itself, that need for velocity and delivery cycle time is nowhere near as high. So the pressure on transforming that application is nowhere near as great. I guess the next approach is going from the ground up and saying, okay, this monolithic application, how can we split it out into constituent chunks? And that might be the first phase of, hey, we split out a front end and a back end component to the system. Then it may be we split out a back end component into stable logic and transformative logic. It may be that we change the application front end from the original monolithic system into more modern technology, driving towards these goals of microservices, containerization, and applications that can support that very, very rapid change frequency churn without impacting the end user. So it's a fairly substantial piece of work. And again, to Mark's point, I think you have to look at it from a business value perspective. Is the value there for the business to actually make the changes that you're thinking about doing?
A lot of people just sort of could lift and shift it, like we do. We have some solutions where we take COBOL apps and lift and shift from on-prem right into the cloud into AWS, and they're quite happy. So it really depends.
Excellent. So we're just about up against the hour, so I want to give you guys a chance to share a final takeaway with our attendees today. So we'll start with Julian and then throw it over to Mark.
Yeah, I think from my side, the key is making sure your organization starts or continues down the road. To Mark's J-curve diagram earlier, there's a lot of challenges with implementing DevOps transformation. There's a lot of challenges with putting net new practices, if that's cultural, if that's tooling, if that's technology, in place. And certain elements will fail and certain elements will be successful. The key is take the learnings from the failures and apply them to your organization so you can make sure that the end goal, which again, whenever you're doing a DevOps transformation, you have to have a quantifiable end goal. It shouldn't be we're implementing CI/CD, it's we're trying to improve delivery and quality through improved velocity, and the execution of that may be through using CI/CD. So making sure that you don't get put off by the losses, making sure that you make sure you track the benefits of the gains, but making sure you're ultimately working against that end objective and those business goals that you put in place.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. Always is, focus on what's important to the business. They're going to let you know where you need to optimize and work. And if you want to find out more, we're going to be talking a lot about this topic at our Micro Focus Universe in May in San Antonio. So please come to San Antonio, and I'd love to meet. Julian and I will both be there, and we're going to have a lot of these kinds of discussions around how to implement and scale DevOps practices across large enterprises. Back to you, David.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, folks, I'd like to thank Julian Fish and Mark Levy for being with us today for this pragmatic look at DevOps. I'd also like to thank Micro Focus, who sponsored today's program. And of course, thanks to all of you for spending time with us today. We really appreciate it. So until next time, I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times. So long for now.